So as I mentioned at the beginning, I was at Phoenix Country Day School yesterday to the high school, and one of our juniors, Noah Kaplan, invited me and to be part of a panel of 5, not all clergy, but some were lay, almost like semi-clergy, faith leaders from 5 different faith systems. And it was a great thing to see, to walk into the quad and hear Rabbi Khan and all these kids from Congregation Beth Israel saying hi, and from camp saying hi, and then I felt so welcome. And then I was the most popular among the 5 people, by the way, because so we have we have a few kids in the high school and from camp, and a couple I hadn't seen since their B'nai Mitzvah, so they got much bigger. So Noah started I guess it's a junior project where they have to, it was Inclusion Week or Tolerance Week at PCDS, and this was his project. He asked a few very basic questions. Everyone talked about the religious systems, the faith systems, all that fun stuff. And I was sitting next to a gentleman from the Hindu community, born in India, but really came to the United States pretty early on in his life and lived in Iowa for a very long time. And he and I were kind of the only funny ones, and doing our shtick. And then he was saying to them, because they were asking us some questions about obviously pluralism and tolerance and all these things, and he put his hand on my shoulder and he said, I have 4 daughters. One's married to a Jewish man in New York, and their daughter's bat mitzvah is next month. One of my daughters, and then he pointed out to this woman, Hannah from the Islamic Speakers Bureau, is married to a Muslim man, and one daughter is, it was like the beginning to one of those walk into a bar jokes, right? One daughter is married to a Christian man who's a Catholic, and finally, my 4th daughter married a Hindu. Like, 20, right? So I just want you to know that we're not the only ones who are concerned with, things like interfaith marriage and who our kids are going to marry. And then he talked about how he called the Jewish daughter is a Hindu, and he said, can you imagine what Christmas is like at my house? And they just call it a happy day celebration. And it got me to thinking about this week's Torah portion, believe it or not, because this week's Torah portion, when you think about every religion, the question that ironically stumped everyone, including me to some extent, was the first question Noah asked was, what are the most basic tenets of your faith tradition, of your religion? And it kind of stumps everyone, because, for a Catholic, they don't want to get up in front of a bunch of high school kids and just talk about Christ, right? They want to make it high school user-friendly. And the people from the Mormon church want to make it, when they're talking about Joseph Smith, none of us wanted to make religion sound, scary and dogmatic, and even though we all have scary dogmatic parts to our religions, each one of us. And it was kind of interesting to see how everyone was tiptoeing around that. But when I got to my turn, one of the things that I talked about was our story, the story of the Jewish people, and how each one of us is connected to that story, not only through our ancestors, who are shared ancestors with most of the Western traditions, right? Abraham and Sarah, or Hagar, if you're Muslim, Isaac, Jacob, Esau. Every one of those characters is part of a story, and our job as Jews is to find ourselves in that story, to connect to the story, and then to enter the world every single day as if our lives matter. Like if there's something that we should be doing to be actively participatory in the story. So this week's Parsha is Vayikra. It is the beginning of the book of Leviticus, but really what it is, it's the beginning of the story of how the Jews, how our ancestors, first time ever, connected to God. Abraham connected to God, Isaac connected to God, Jacob connected to God, Moses connected to God. God connects to individuals, goes to Mount Sinai, does the very scary thing at Mount Sinai, right? But they had not ever been taught ritual. They had not ever been taught how to have a relationship with God, how to give praise to God, how to give thanks to God, how to feel sorry and apologize, how to see themselves as part of not only the story of our ancestors, but active participants in that connection that our ancestors did up until this point. So Vayikra, Leviticus, is an incredibly important book. It's at the center, obviously, of the 5 books. It's the middle book. And it is the book that yeshiva students in Orthodox yeshivot study first, because it contains all of the rules and regulations on ritual. But that's not enough, because rituals changed, because the sacrifice system broke down, Judaism had to change too. So I wanted to read something to you from Rabbi Bradley Shavit Artson that I think is pretty poignant about this whole system of sacrifice. Because the first ever way that the Israelites are going to worship God, connect to God, begins in this story. And the first ever way that they're going to do it is through a very weird, violent, fiery system of offering animal sacrifices. That is to say, they didn't go to temple with prayer books and sing Shalom Rav. I'm sorry. Although the song itself did come from Mount Sinai, they weren't doing that. They were offering sacrifices. Here's what Rabbi Artson says, and then I want to just add a few more words, and then I promise I'll be done. He says, the central focus of Vayikra, as I was mentioning, is on establishing a sacred community. As I said, it's the first time that the community is formed in a nation of priests whose daily deeds perfect the world under God's rule. By establishing this ideal community, Vayikra, Leviticus, recognizes that deeds are more eloquent than words, that living in a holy community can provide a sense of God's presence far more pervasive than more ethereal approaches. But few modern Jews would have any problem, at least in theory, with those general remarks, right? That's what we're all trying to achieve. That's why we're all here tonight, at least in theory. But the problem starts when we examine how Vayikra defines the detailed practices of having a sacred community. What kind of deeds were they supposed to do to build their community, especially as a community of worshipers? So at the center, he says, of this book lies the preoccupation with animal and vegetative sacrifice, which is far from the worldview of most contemporary Jews and most contemporary Americans, for that matter. My daughter's vegan. This is all bad, right? When we think of religious devotion, we tend to picture silent prayer, appreciation of nature, perhaps even a commitment to ethical monotheism, ethical living. But this idea of killing animals and serving the Lord escapes us completely. He continues to say, to understand our own sacred heritage as Jews, to appreciate the religious perspective that emerges from Torah and Talmud and most of Jewish writings in general, we have to come to understand the centrality of this system that from whence we came, the temple ritual and temple sacrifice. Now, objections, he concludes, well, he's not second to conclude, a penultimate statement. Objection to animal sacrifices are obviously readily abound. It's bloody, barbaric, too physical, very, very idiosyncratic, and it's very zero-sum. You do it right or you do it wrong. It's either pure or it's not kind of pure, it's impure. The categories of how sacrifices are accepted and given leave no room for error. If you do it wrong, it is totally wrong. Dogma is not something any of us is comfortable with. But he says something, and this is very interesting, I think. Life is not neatly packaged, fully controllable, or completely comprehensible. Life includes tragedies of staggering proportions, disappointments of trivial pettiness, jealousies, violence, and rage. Each one of us contains many layers of feelings, drives, and convictions. Only the surface, most layer of our personality is verbal, cheerful, and polite. But the deeper layers of the human psyche are nonverbal, contradictory, and impulsive. Each one of us contains the person we were at every previous stage of development. All previous ages we have ever lived, all of those competing levels and drives require some mode of expression. If we attempt to deny them and consequently to stifle them, they will erupt into destructive and inappropriate ways. What I think he's saying here, among many very, very thoughtful things, is that Judaism is filled with, in this sense and in this parsha, all of these rituals, all of these places for connection, all of these acts and deeds that every single one of us, I would imagine every single one of us, I don't want to speak for everyone, but I'm imagining, find anachronistic and obsolete and not meaningful. If I were to walk into the room tonight with a cow and have a fire set up here and tell you this barbecued cow is our way of connecting with God, you would think I was nuts. But for them, that was not only authentically Jewish ritual way of communicating with God. In fact, the word for sacrifice, korban, means to draw close. They saw it as a way of getting close to God through the community. But we would see it as obsolete. So it had to change when the temple was destroyed by necessity. And it changed it into prayers. So we've got a book filled with prayers. But I bet you more than a majority of people in this room find the prayers obsolete. They talk about a God in a hierarchical sense. They talk about the prayers talk about thoughts that many, many generations ago made a lot of sense, but don't really make a lot of sense to us now. They contain prayers where we're asking God for peace and for love and for healing and for health. But the people around us still get sick and die, and there are accidents and there are tragedies. And so for many, the third rail of Judaism, if you will, is that prayer is meaningless. So if sacrifice is meaningless and prayer is obsolete and meaningless, what are we going to do? The Zionists had a great idea. They used the same concept of what we call in the Torah sacrifice, what we call prayer, into work, avodah. For the Zionists, connection with God was connecting with the land of Israel, literally with the soil, building kibbutzes, digging the dirt, getting dirty, putting in all of the infrastructure, settling the land, growing fruit in the desert, creating drip irrigation because they had no water and using their minds and innovation. That was as authentic a way of connecting with God as prayer was for our ancestors and still is now, as sacrifice was in the times of the Bible. I think that what Rabbi Artson is saying when he says every one of us contains a person that we were at every privileged stage of development, but to be Jewish is to recognize that sacrifice was the way our ancestors connected. Prayer is the way that some of us and some of our parents and grandparents connected. For a kibbutznik, living in Israel was the way of being connected, of korban, of connecting to God. But a lot of us are left a little bit empty when it comes to finding connections and meaningful connections to God. I think we're in that next phase where we're going to acknowledge and understand that all of these different methods of connecting to God exist, but that the fundamental idea is that we have to find ways to connect to God that are new, that are innovative, that are different, that may sound a little strange as animal sacrifice sounds, but in order to make a Judaism that is meaningful for us, meaningful for our children and grandchildren, if the prayers aren't doing it for you, and animal sacrifice isn't an option, and moving to Israel isn't something that you're going to be doing tomorrow, we as a community are indeed, I think, commanded to create innovative and new practices, ways of worshiping and connecting that are unknown to us now. On this Shabbat, I'd like us to think, this is not he's being New Age. No, this is not a New Age idea. This is a 3,000-year-old idea. Judaism has to change. Prayer has to change. Worship has to change. The thing that cannot change is using whatever it is, utilizing whatever it is that we create to make holiness, to make a holy community, to create a place where we can change the world. That cannot change. That's been the common denominator in all the systems of korbanot, in all the systems of connecting to God. So on this Shabbat, think about how it is that you connect to God and give yourself permission. I'm giving you permission to be okay with it if the prayers don't work for you. Because it creates this very hierarchical God who's sort of a puppet master, if you look at the words literally. Give yourself permission to look at things metaphorically when you see the prayers. Give yourself permission to write your own prayers, to have your own kind of worship, your own experience. That is so authentically Jewish. It is. It's been done before. It has to be done again. Let's not be fearful of change. Let's not be fearful, as me and my colleagues were yesterday, of saying this is how it was in our religious faith traditions, but this is how it is and how it needs to be in order for us to continue to connect and create community. I pray on this Shabbat that we're able to have our own little Vayikra moments this Shabbat. Have one thought of how it is that you will connect to God. It doesn't have to be something that already exists. It can be your own. It can be new. And we'll talk about it. Why not? It's been done before. Shabbat Shalom.